Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam with Historic Travels, and as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And in case you would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the Historic Travels YouTube channel a little bit more, I did create a Patreon. There's a link for that down below if you guys would like to check that out. Thank you guys, I appreciate it. And alright guys, well hey, you all been asking for this video for a long time and the time has finally come. In today's video, we're going to be talking about one of the lesser known, yet in my mind, one of the most horrifying disasters to ever land upon an ocean liner at sea. This video is going to be covering the sinking of a vessel called the Estonia.
The Estonia was essentially an ocean liner / passenger ferry vessel that could carry both passengers and their vehicles across the Baltic Sea from the country of Estonia to the country of Sweden. Now, on the night of September 28, 1994, this vessel encountered a very rough storm with high seas and strong winds, and in less than an hour, the entire vessel capsized and sank with a great loss of life. What happened to this vessel to cause it to sink so quickly, and how come so many lives were lost when this vessel sank?
Well, to put it simply, poor design quality. You see, the Estonia vessel had a number of major problems in the ship's design, which led the way to this disaster even being possible in the first place. And you see, these problems with the ship's design was not caught by the safety board that actually reviewed the vessel and deemed her seaworthy. Under their eye, they said that this ship was perfectly safe and perfectly seaworthy to sail anywhere in the world. However, as they would soon find out in the year 1994, the poor design problems in this ship all cascaded together to create the perfect disaster.
So what were these design problems with the Estonia that led it to sink? Well, you see, the first problem came with the ship's visor. The visor was the Estonia's movable bow section. You see, the bow of the Estonia could lift up, and this is how they were able to get cars inside of the ship. Essentially, they would just lift up the Estonia's bow section, cars would drive in, then they would secure it in the ship's cargo hold for the voyage. And you see, part of the ship's bow section was a ramp that cars would use to drive inside of the ship. And this ramp also acted as a massive watertight bulkhead protecting the ship from flooding. So you see, both the ship's bow section, which was watertight, and the ramp that cars would use to drive inside the ship was also watertight. So essentially, the Estonia had two watertight bulkheads right behind the ship's bow section.
So you're probably thinking right now, well, that sounds like a great design feature. You know, having those two watertight bulkheads right there at the front of the ship, especially where the first watertight bulkhead can move and lift up like that, would be a great design feature. Well, you see, here's where the problem comes in. The second watertight bulkhead, the most crucial one, the ramp that actually protects the interior sections of the ship from flooding, was built too close to the ship's visor. So if anything was to happen to the front of the ship and it somehow gets ripped off of the hull, then it was built so close to the ramp that it actually posed a risk to the ramp. So essentially, if the visor fell off of the Estonia somehow, the falling debris or the act of that section of the ship falling off could damage the ramp, causing the vessel to flood. And as you'll soon come to see, that is exactly what happened to the Estonia the night she sank.
The vessel Estonia began its last voyage on September 27, 1994. It was going to commit a short overnight crossing across the Baltic Sea, leaving from the city of Tallinn, located in Estonia, and dropping its passengers off in the city of Stockholm, located in Sweden. However, as the vessel was traversing the Baltic Sea, a very severe storm moved in, causing very high waves to slam into the side of the ship, and also very severe wind was also rocking the ship, creating pretty harsh conditions for the people on board. So a lot of people were getting seasick and retiring to their cabins early due to the heavy rocking of the ship.
The ocean was so rough that night that survivors said that you couldn't take 2 steps inside the ship before the sinking started without stumbling or falling. I mean, that's just how much stress the ship was under as it was getting rocked and rolled by all these waves that were slamming into the hull. I mean, honestly, it'd be a pretty terrifying thing even if the ship wasn't sinking. One survivor said that as she was crossing past the ship's cargo hold area, she was in a hallway right beside the cargo hold, she could hear all the cars inside the ship's car alarms blaring due to the rocking and waving of the ship, you know, moving the cars around and triggering the car alarms. She said it really scared her. Now, a little bit later, after the ship had been dealing with these harsh conditions for a while, people in the cargo hold, where all the cars were, or in the area surrounding it, said that they heard a very loud bang suddenly vibrate through the ship.
The loud bang that people heard came from the Estonia's visor section, and you see inside that section there were 3 massive locks that held the visor to the ship, thus keeping that watertight. And you see every time the Estonia hit a giant wave, it was putting a lot of strain on the locks holding the visor in place, until finally the visor couldn't take the strain anymore, and all 3 locks failed one by one, thus allowing the entire visor section of the Estonia to rip off in the Baltic Sea, thus allowing a massive opening to exist within the hull of the ship, allowing water easy access to flow inside the hull.
And you see, when the entire front section of the Estonia fell off, it ended up clipping or damaging the ramp, the second watertight compartment within the Estonia, thus allowing water to get inside the ship. Now, if you saw in that last animation, that shows the entire ramp door just falling open real quick and then allowing a ton of water to gush inside. However, I don't think that's accurate. I think the ramp door only opened up slightly due to the falling off of the ship's visor section, because a crew member was later inside the ship's cargo hold where all the cars were, and he said there was a lot of water in there. So the fact that he was able to walk in there and report that, yeah, this room was flooding, tells me that the ship wasn't taking on water at a crazy heavy rate in the early stages of the sinking. You would think that if the entire ramp fell open, then you wouldn't be able to walk in there. Water would be gushing in at such a rapid rate.
And just in case you were wondering why the people on the bridge weren't freaking out that the entire bow section of their ship came off, well, you see, this is another design problem with the Estonia. You see, the way the bridge is positioned, the entire bow section of the Estonia is hidden from view from the officers on the bridge. So essentially, the bow part of the Estonia is a big blind spot. So that means when the bow section of the ship came off, the people on the bridge had no idea.
Even though the officers on the bridge had no clear view of the bow section of the Estonia, they still had 2 ways in which they could monitor that part of the ship for trouble. You see, the first one was they had a control panel on the bridge that had a bunch of lights on it that would glow a certain color if the cargo hatch on the visor on the ship was secure and shut. And as far as that control panel was concerned, the ship was secure and the door and visor were shut, no problem. And the only other method that they could use to monitor was a security camera that fed into that room. However, here's where another design flaw with the Estonia comes in. The TV screen that displayed the feed from that camera was located behind the ship's officers, kind of like this TV is behind me right there. So that meant that if the ship's crew were looking straight ahead out at sea and not looking behind them, they would have no idea that this room was flooding.
And this is also where the last major problem with the Estonia's design would come into effect, thus sealing the fate of the ship. You see, if the Estonia was weighed down by a bunch of cars, like it was on the night it sank, if just 10 inches of water would find its way inside the hull, then the ship could be thrown off an even keel by one big wave. And this is exactly what happened. One massive wave slammed into the side of the ship, thus throwing all this water to one side. And that was enough to throw the ship off an even keel and cause a rapid list of 15 degrees to starboard almost immediately.
Another important thing to keep in mind is remember that all of this happened in the middle of the night. You see, the Estonia started to sink around 1:15 a.m., so most people were already asleep in their cabins. I mean, there's not much else to do when a ship is rocking that much. You can't really do anything without stumbling, so yeah, you just go to bed. So that meant that most of the people on board were just thrown from their beds against the wall when the ship took a rapid list to starboard. I mean, can you imagine how horrifying that would be? So while all the passengers are scrambling, trying to figure out what's going on, the crew on the bridge are freaking out because they're trying to figure out why the Estonia is listing at such a heavy degree. And they don't know what's going on. They don't know the entire bow section is missing. So after some time, the ship goes into a blackout while people are still trying to escape and while the ship is continuing to list more and more. I mean, horrible situation. And when the crew on the bridge were announcing their position that, hey, they need help, they weren't able to give out the ship's exact coordinates due to the blackout. I mean, things went from bad to worse on the Estonia almost immediately.
Now, due to the heavy list of the Estonia, this also began to push windows underwater, thus accelerating the rate of flooding for the ship, and increasing the listing of the vessel even more. At just 15 minutes after the initial list began, so we're jumping from 1:15 to 1:30 a.m. here, the ship was already leaning at around 60 degrees, which meant it was getting more and more difficult for the people inside of the vessel to try and find their way out. At this point, there was nothing the crew could do as far as trying to save the passengers inside the ship. It was up to each individual passenger to try to get up on deck and escape the rapidly listing and sinking vessel on their own.
Eventually, it does seem like they were able to restore at least some power to the Estonia during the final stages of the sinking. And I think this is backed up due to the fact that so many passengers inside the ship were able to escape the hull of the rapidly sinking vessel. I mean, just think about it. If you were a passenger inside of this ship and you got suddenly woken up by a rapidly sharp list and the power went out, how would you escape the vessel? I mean, if you are inside this ship and it's pitch black and it's listing, it's being rocked by waves, and I mean, every second that goes by, the ship is rolling more and more onto its side. I mean, I think it would be near impossible to escape the ship under those conditions. You would have to have at least some light, maybe emergency lights. But anyway, the crew was eventually able to transmit the Estonia's actual location, so there was help on the way. However, when this was all done, the ship had already developed such a steep list that it was almost impossible for anybody still inside the hull to escape the rapidly sinking vessel. Now, around 1:50 a.m., the Estonia was listing at 90 degrees. So at this point, it would have been impossible for anybody still inside the ship to get out. And anybody that was on the boat deck, the only choice they had was to jump. And that's what all the survivors did. They just jumped from the ship into the Baltic Sea. And they only could survive by clinging to any kind of, life preservers or any inflatable life rafts that got thrown overboard. That was all they had. Remember, no lifeboats were able to be launched from the Estonia. And then around 2:10 a.m., the Estonia completely capsized, flipped upside down with its propellers and rudder sticking up out of the water. And it seems like she sunk stern first as she slowly dipped beneath the surface on the Baltic Sea. Now, of the 1,000 people that were on board the Estonia, only 137 of them were able to survive the night. So that is a huge loss of life for the Estonia. And even though more people died on board the Titanic, I think the Estonia was a far worse situation to be in than the people on the Titanic had to experience. Because on the Titanic, there was a gradual buildup before all hell broke loose on board the ship. With the Estonia, all hell broke loose immediately. So people on the Estonia had no clue what was going on. They had no time to react. They had no time to try to save themselves. They were just thrown into chaos immediately. Titanic was a worse disaster. Don't take what I said out of context. But what I'm just saying is, as far as the scale of the nightmare of the situation that these people on board the Estonia were facing, I think the Estonia was far worse than anything anybody on the Titanic experienced. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. And yeah, now you all have learned the story of the Estonia, one of the worst disasters to ever fall upon any vessel ever, period, in my opinion. I honestly cannot imagine what it would have been like to be on the Estonia that night, and I hope no one ever has to experience that again. Anyway, guys, if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you, guys. It really helps out a lot. All right, everybody. Well, hey, you all stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night, everybody.